Orcs, elves, dwarfs, wizards, and halflings are all staples in video games. At this point, it almost seems like they belong to video games. The fantasy genre today is so connected to video games that they appear inseparable. One might then assume that if anyone understands fantasy best, it would be gamers. But I would argue that such a person would be sorely mistaken. On the contrary, I would argue that the way fantasy is nearly always handled in the video game industry betrays either a complete misunderstanding or utter disregard for the foundational principles of the genre. Let me begin by going back to the authors who are considered the fathers of modern fantasy, Tolkien and Lewis. Both authors were profoundly influenced by 19th century fantasy pioneer and mentor of Lewis Carroll, George MacDonald. MacDonald, being a congregational minister, understood his role as the creator of imaginary worlds as part of being made in the image of God, the creator of the real world. As a result, fantasy worlds must have an inner consistency, abiding by its own internal laws, to become just as believable as the real world that God created. Tolkien adopted this idea, deeming it subcreation, which is a term that refers to the fact that only God created ex nihilo, or out of nothing, and that we as his creatures can only create with the materials that he has provided us, and in imitation of his own creation. In this way, human creativity is an imitation of the divine, and man achieves the most excellence in his world-building craft when he most closely imitates his own creator. Both Lewis and Tolkien viewed the creation of fantasy worlds not as a disregard for the real world, but actually as a celebration of it. Central to the fantasy genre for them both was the concept which Lewis called re-enchantment and Tolkien called recovery, which is the idea that our world is itself an enchanting magical world, but that our overfamiliarity with it has blinded us to that fact. Therefore, a chief task of fantasy is to recontextualize things from our own world, to cause us to be re-enchanted with our own world, to see its beauty, truth, and goodness afresh. But as Christianity maintains a tension between the goodness of the world as created by God, with the fallenness that has resulted from the sin of man, so also fantasy likewise provides escape. This, Tolkien writes, is the escape not of a deserter, but of a prisoner. Our experience in the real world can often become mundane and full of suffering, and we can easily become convinced of wrong ways of viewing the world and ourselves. But fantasy allows an escape into a world free of these things, providing escape for our minds from the curses of a fallen world. Related to this, fantasy also provides consolation through what Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, which means a good catastrophe. Tolkien described it as a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of the sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It gives a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world. Examples of a eucatastrophe are Gandalf's sudden arrival at Helm's Deep, which up to that point seemed an impossible battle, or in Lewis's That Hideous Strength, when the technocratic organization NICE is suddenly destroyed by a cacophony of forces of nature. These were sudden, miraculous events, pregnant with hope and meaning, that burst into a scene of hopelessness and suffering. George R.R. Martin has complained about aspects of Tolkien's writing that generally fit under these categories of what Tolkien found essential to fantasy. Martin complained, for instance, that Gandalf didn't stay dead, which for Tolkien was an important instance of eucatastrophe. And whereas Tolkien ends his story with consolation, a happy ending in which Aragorn becomes king and rules well and wisely for hundreds of years, Martin complains that there was not enough mention of the logistics of his rule, such as the difficulties of immigration and tax policy. In other words, he wants fantasy to be the very opposite of an escape and consolation. If we define fantasy the way that Tolkien defined it, then George Martin actually simply dislikes the fantasy genre. Instead, he prefers a nihilistic escape into the worst parts of the real world, essentially a disenchantment with the real world. Fantasy is, for Martin, in Tolkien's words, the escape of a deserter, not of a prisoner. In fact, Martin would have us remain prisoners in his sad distortion of fantasy. I feel essentially the same about the writing in the Dragon Age series. Among fantasy games, I at least give them credit for putting in the effort to write something with some kind of depth, but there is little I would actually consider legitimate recovery, escape, or consolation. Like Martin's fantasy world, it is full of endless conflicts and moral ambiguity. Instead of escaping into a world that provides clarity about truth and goodness in the real world, and opens my eyes in new ways to the beauty of the world, It just reminds me of the endless political conflicts of the worst parts of real life. It's not a world that inspires me to keep playing because I don't care about complex conflicts that just feel pragmatic rather than matters of good versus evil. And of course, on top of that, there's the woke propaganda to even further ruin any element of escape that might have occurred. For instance, not many hours into Dragon Age Inquisition, I was approached by the transgender character Krem, who was born out of BioWare's panel discussion about how to be more LGBTQXIZ inclusive in games. As soon as you are trying to insert characters that are solely about making a political point in the real world, you have completely abandoned fantasy. I want to escape from the lies of the modern world and woke corporatism, and BioWare's characters instead make sure I can't forget about it. As with Martin, though they incorporate fantasy races, magic, and medieval-ish peoples, they have no concern for the core principles of what truly constitutes fantasy. They simply don't get it. In addition to the principles of fantasy, crucial to fantasy's founding fathers was also their influences. Tolkien was a philologist whose passion for language heavily influenced his writing. In particular, his study of Germanic, Celtic, Finnish, Slavic, and Greek language and mythology constituted the conceptual world from which he constructed his imaginary world. His study and translation of Old English literature in particular provided inspiration for many characters, stories, and creatures in his writings. For instance, the name orc came from a list of creatures in the original Old English of the epic poem Beowulf, and both the Ents and the Tower Orthans came from another Old English poem called Maxims II. Tolkien was ultimately drawing from myths of peoples of the past, which gave meaning and enchantment to whole societies for generations, in order to provide the same things to his own English people. It was a process that was far more meaningful than modern fantasy worlds that are entirely detached from such intellectual and historical roots. Lewis was likewise inspired by his own academic career as well. He was professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, and described himself as a medieval man living in the 20th century. He wrote in such a way that his scholarly works on English literature and medieval philosophy, his endeavors in theology, and his works of fiction all mutually inform one another, forming together almost one argument for the mere enjoyment of the gift of life and the world we live in. Especially relevant is his work, The Discarded Image, which discusses the glorious medieval conception of the world. For instance, he discusses how they viewed the heavens not merely as an empty space, but an expanse of beauty and spiritual significance that presented us an image of the true heavens, where God and angelic beings dwell. This idea would influence his depiction of space in his space trilogy, as a place full of life and warmth, as well as the discussion between the star Ramandu and Eustace, in which Eustace says, "In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas." To which the star replies, "Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of." For Lewis and Tolkien, and the fantasy authors that preceded them, their fiction was an extension of their passionate pursuit of meaning. It was their academic prose transfigured into the glorious form of fiction, where the truth of what they had discovered in the academy was translated into something which could be imagined and felt. Just as no story in Middle-earth is complete until it is made poetry and put to a tune, so also the meaning of the world for them was not truly appreciated until it made its way into new worlds that conveyed meaning through beautiful narratives that reached the heart. I hope you can now see my disappointment when fantasy world after fantasy world merely exists as a backdrop for slashing and looting, nerdy role-playing, or in the case of Game of Thrones, medieval porn. Obviously, games don't purely exist for the story. Even though I'm not all that impressed with the stories of Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3, and Elden Ring, they at least have well-designed maps to explore and fun gameplay. But as has been the theme of my videos thus far, I believe that video games are capable of far more than they have achieved thus far, and storytelling is where they have nearly unanimously fallen flat. Being someone who is passionate about fantasy as it used to be understood by authors like MacDonald, Tolkien, and Lewis, I simply can't help but be disappointed in games that I feel should be my favorites. Modern fantasy writers simply don't understand fantasy. And since all the great fantasy writers died before the invention of video games, that means I have yet to get a fantasy game that truly left me feeling satisfied. My hope is that there is a renewal of interest in going back to the sources of the fantasy genre, and truly considering what makes the genre great. Until then, I am afraid I will continue to be disappointed. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Please like and subscribe and all that.